Hercules' life was a chain of suffering, madness, and redemption. We know him for his 12 labors. But beyond the 12 labors lies the legend of how a mortal became a god through the greatest of trials, the story of a painful journey from tragedy to Olympus. Tonight, you will hear a story not so much about the strength of the ancient hero, but about the price that is paid for immortality. Behind the myth hides a man who fell and rose again, who killed and repented, who suffered and kept moving forward. He served a weak king whom he despised, yet he fulfilled his duty. He was born in the wrath of the gods. He killed his own family, and when his body burned on the funeral pyre, his soul rose to Olympus. Not because he was strong, but because he did not give up. For as the ancients knew, the path to the stars lies through the thorns of great suffering. Hercules is the eternal proof of that. Close your eyes, take a breath, and welcome to the Plateau of Plato, your sanctuary for sleep. In this video, we explore the life of Heracles, better known to many as Hercules. Before we journey to the Bronze Age, let us take a moment to realize just how close this ancient hero is to us. How his shadow stretches across the Atlantic and settles, quietly, in your own pocket. Let me explain what I am hinting at so vaguely. To perform his 10th, truly cowboy-like labor, when he had to drive the cattle of the three-bodied giant Geryon back to Greece on the golden boat lent to him by the sun god Helios, Hercules set out for the island of Erythea, a place so distant that the ancient Greeks considered it the edge of the world. To get there, Hercules traveled to the westernmost point of the Mediterranean, where the sea meets the endless ocean. There, according to legend, he set up 2 massive stone pillars, one on the northern shore, the other on the southern, marking the boundary of the world. Beyond these pillars, the Greeks believed there was nothing but endless water. The Romans called them the Pillars of Hercules. Today we know them as the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Spain and Morocco, where the Atlantic Ocean flows into the Mediterranean Sea. On the pillars, the Romans carved a warning in Latin, non plus ultra, nothing further. To reach the pillars meant to reach the limit, the end, the boundary beyond which no one could pass. However, one day a man named Christopher Columbus crossed that boundary, setting sail into the endless ocean. When he returned with news of a new world, the old warning lost its meaning. Beyond the pillars, there was something more. A whole continent. The Spanish king, inspired by the discovery, removed the word non from the ancient motto. What remained was plus ultra, further beyond. The Pillars of Hercules, wrapped with a ribbon bearing this new motto, appeared on the Spanish coat of arms. And from there, they crossed the ocean to America. You see them every day. You hold them in your hands, if you still use cash. On Spanish colonial coins, the Spanish dollars that were legal tender in the United States until 1857, 2 pillars were depicted, wrapped with a ribbon curving in the shape of an S. Some historians believe that this image, simplified over time, became the dollar sign. 2 vertical lines and a winding ribbon. An ancient boundary marker turned into the most recognizable symbol of modern commerce. The Pillars of Hercules, the boundary that was once a warning of the end of the world, became the gateway through which the new world was opened. But that is not all. In 1915, at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, the artist Perham Wilhelm Noll created a striking poster. A giant Hercules standing over North and South America, prying them apart to open the Panama Canal, a new passage through the very land he once divided. The canal was called the 13th labor of Hercules, a symbol of American ingenuity, ambition, and the ability to reshape the world. Even Benjamin Franklin saw in Hercules a symbol for the young American nation and proposed his image for the design of coins and the Great Seal of the United States. And in 1784, an allegorical painting was created, the American Union, where Hercules stands on a bridge of 13 states, a symbol of unity and strength for the newborn country. The Pillars of Hercules began as a warning, a sign of the end of the world. But they became a promise to go further, to push boundaries, to reach for what lies beyond the known. And now, 2,500 years after he set up those pillars at the edge of the world, his mark still stands on every dollar you spend, on every coin you hold, on every monument to ambition in a country that was once beyond. So tonight, when you close your eyes and let this story unfold, remember, you are not listening to merely a legend from ancient Greece. You are listening to a story that never truly ended, a story that still lives, quietly, in the palm of your hand. I suppose, since you are here, you are one of those who still uses cash from time to time. We journey back to the Bronze Age, to those distant times of which historical records remain closely intertwined with myths and legends, specifically to the middle of the second millennium BC, when the Mycenaean civilization flourished on the territory of modern Greece. Greece was then not a single country, but a multitude of small kingdoms scattered across the southern part of the Balkan Peninsula and the islands of the Aegean Sea. These kingdoms constantly warred with each other for land, for cattle, for glory, and for control over trade routes. The largest centers of this civilization were Mycenae on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, Tiryns nearby, and Thebes in the region of Boeotia in central Greece. Thebes, where our story begins, was one of the most powerful cities of that time, surrounded by strong walls and ruling over a fertile plain that gave its inhabitants grain, olives, and grapes. It was in this world, where the Olympian gods constantly interfered in the affairs of mortals, and where a man's fate often depended on the whim of the celestials, that our hero was destined to be born. His mother was Alcmene, the daughter of the king of Mycenae, who belonged to the noblest family in Greece, tracing her lineage back to Perseus himself, the legendary hero who slew the Gorgon Medusa. Alcmene was married to Amphitryon, a warrior of equally noble birth, who was also a descendant of Perseus. However, their marriage was overshadowed by tragedy. During a quarrel, Amphitryon accidentally killed his father-in-law, King Electryon, with a thrown club and was exiled from his lands for this crime. Together with Alcmene and her younger brother Lysimneus, he fled from Mycenae and made his way to Thebes, where King Chilon ruled. Chilon was not merely a ruler, but also a relative of Amphitryon, which made him a natural protector for the exile. According to ancient Greek laws, spilled blood defiled a man, and every killer had to perform special purification rites to wash away the defilement. Therefore, Chilon, having received Amphitryon, performed over him the ritual of purification from the sin of unintentional murder. This rite likely included sacrifices and libations, intended to remove the heavy burden of guilt from the killer's soul and to appease the gods. Thus Amphitryon and Alcmene found refuge in Thebes, where they were to experience events that would forever change their fates. However, Amphitryon, being a warrior, could not remain idle for long. He set out on a military campaign against the Teleboans, a powerful sea people who inhabited the islands off the western coast of Greece and controlled important trade routes in the Ionian Sea. Their ships struck fear into the coastal cities. The pretext for the war was that the Teleboans had stolen the herds belonging to the house of Electrian, and Amphitryon, as the son-in-law of the deceased king, considered it his duty to recover the lost property and restore the family's honor. The war with the Teleboans was long and exhausting. King Tereleus of the Teleboans was the grandson of Poseidon himself. Thanks to his grandfather's divine gift, Tereleus was immortal. The source of his immortality lay in a single golden hair growing on his head. As long as this hair was with him, no weapon could harm him, and no siege could take his city. But Tereleus had a daughter named Comitho. She saw Amphitryon and was seized with a passionate love for him. Her feelings were absolutely unrequited. All versions of the myth agree on this. Amphitryon was a faithful husband, and his heart already belonged to his wife forever. Therefore, Comitho could never win his love, no matter what she did. But out of desperate hope to earn Amphitryon's love and to evoke a reciprocal feeling in him, Comitho secretly crept to her sleeping father and tore out that very golden hair that granted him immortality. Deprived of it, Tereleus instantly became mortal and soon fell by the hand of Amphitryon. The city was taken, the enemy defeated. But Amphitryon showed no gratitude to his savior. He ordered Comitho to be executed. He considered her betrayal of her father unworthy. This story of the golden hair that granted immortality and was torn out through betrayal has parallels in other world cultures. In the biblical Old Testament, in the book of Judges, the story is told of the mighty warrior Samson, whose incredible strength was also connected to his hair. Like Tereleus, Samson was endowed with special strength as long as his hair remained untouched. However, if the Greek king had only one hair, and it was removed by his daughter, Samson's strength lay in his long hair, which was a symbol of his dedication to God and his Nazirite vow. His beloved Delilah, bribed by Samson's enemies, the Philistines, discovered his secret and, having lulled him to sleep, ordered the 7 locks of his head to be shorn. As soon as this was done, strength left Samson, and he was captured, blinded, and thrown into prison. Thus, in both cases, we see a similar plot: a hero whose life or strength depends on his hair, and a woman who, driven by love or greed, deprives him of this protection. In Norse mythology, the hair of the goddess Sif, Thor's wife, symbolized fertility and harvest, and when the trickster god Loki cut it off, it threatened the very well-being of the world. The power of her hair was directly connected to the life force of the earth. In Hinduism, the matted hair of the god Shiva embodies the power lines of the universe, and his dreadlocks are considered the receptacle of the mighty power of his mind. In ancient Mesoamerica, hair was also perceived as a receptacle of spiritual power. It was believed to form a protective covering preventing the departure of life energy from the body. Everywhere, from the Slavs, who believed that wisdom and a woman's strength were contained in her braid, to the Frankish kings, for whom a haircut meant renunciation of the throne, hair was perceived as the focus of life energy, and its loss as a loss of strength, dignity, and even immortality. Meanwhile, while Amphitryon was warring against the Teleboans, Zeus, seated on his throne on Olympus, was contemplating a great plan that he had been nurturing for a long time. His design was not merely a whim, but a deeply considered strategy aimed at strengthening his power and protecting the world from the forces of chaos that constantly threatened to disrupt the established order. Zeus understood that the time was coming when new monsters, born of ancient forces, would appear on earth, and that to fight them, a hero would be needed, possessing superhuman strength and unyielding will. This hero was to become the defender of mortals and immortals, one who could restore justice and punish evil wherever it appeared. And Zeus decided that this hero would be his son, born of a mortal woman but endowed with divine power. His choice fell on Alcmene, the beautiful and virtuous wife of Amphitryon, who was not only beautiful but also possessed a pure soul and a strong character. Zeus knew that only such a woman could raise a man capable of enduring all the trials that fate had in store for him. Moreover, Zeus had a very specific political plan that made the choice of Alcmene even more significant. He swore that his son, born on a certain day, would become the ruler of Mycenae and all the surrounding lands. This was a carefully considered administrative step to bring to power a worthy heir from the lineage of Perseus, who could unite the Greek lands and become a symbol of strength and justice. However, Zeus knew that Alcmene, being a faithful wife, would never voluntarily agree to become the mother of his son, and therefore resorted to cunning. He took on the form of Amphitryon, Alcmene's husband, and appeared to her when she was alone. The beautiful Alcmene, seeing her beloved husband returning from war, joyfully rushed to meet him. She, unaware of the deception, received him as her spouse and gladly responded to his offer to share his bed. Zeus not only achieved his goal, but, wishing to prolong his pleasure, commanded the sun not to rise and the moon not to set, and his night with Alcmene lasted 3 times longer than any other. And then it gets even more interesting. The real Amphitryon returned from the war the very next morning, before they had even had time to change the sheets. And he also spent the night with his wife. As a result, Alcmene conceived 2 sons from 2 different fathers, one from Zeus, the other from Amphitryon. This double pregnancy was unique in Greek mythology, and it became a harbinger of the complex fate that awaited the elder of the 2 boys, the son of Zeus. This story of the golden hair that granted immortality and was torn out through betrayal has parallels in other world cultures. In the biblical Old Testament, in the book of Judges, the story is told of the mighty warrior Samson, whose incredible strength was also connected to his hair. Like Hercules, Samson was endowed with special strength as long as his hair remained untouched. However, if the Greek king had only one hair, and it was removed by his daughter, Samson's strength lay in his long hair, which was a symbol of his dedication to God and his Nazirite vow. His beloved Delilah, bribed by Samson's enemies, the Philistines, discovered his secret and, having lulled him to sleep, ordered the 7 locks of his head to be shorn. As soon as this was done, strength left Samson, and he was captured, blinded, and thrown into prison. Thus, in both cases, we see a similar plot: a hero whose life or strength depends on his hair, and a woman who, driven by love or greed, deprives him of this protection. In Norse mythology, the hair of the goddess Sif, Thor's wife, symbolized fertility and harvest, and when the trickster god Loki cut it off, it threatened the very well-being of the world. The power of her hair was directly connected to the life force of the earth. In Hinduism, the matted hair of the god Shiva embodies the power lines of the universe, and his dreadlocks are considered the receptacle of the mighty power of his mind. In ancient Mesoamerica, hair was also perceived as a receptacle of spiritual power. It was believed to form a protective covering preventing the departure of life energy from the body. Everywhere, from the Slavs, who believed that wisdom and a woman's strength were contained in her braid, to the Frankish kings, for whom a haircut meant renunciation of the throne. Hair was perceived as the focus of life energy, and its loss as a loss of strength, dignity, and even immortality. Now for the details. When Amphitryon returned from the war, he was filled with pride, because he had defeated the Teleboans and recovered the herds. But his joy was clouded by a strange misunderstanding that had occurred in his own house. When he entered the chambers of his wife, the women's quarters, and began to embrace and kiss her passionately, having missed her during his absence, Alcmene received him with surprise, almost with fear, and she said, "My lord, why have you returned so soon? You just spent the night with me and left at dawn, and you are already here again." Amphitryon froze. His face turned pale and then red with anger, because he understood that something was wrong, and he demanded that Alcmene explain herself. She, not understanding that she had done anything wrong, told him about how he had returned from the war, how they had spent the night together, and how he had been tender and loving, and how he had caressed her until the morning. Amphitryon, who knew that he had not been home and that he could not have been with her, understood that someone else had visited his wife, and he was seized with horror and rage. Amphitryon understood nothing, and he turned to the seer Tiresias, who lived in Thebes and who was known for his wisdom, his gift of foresight, and to whom everything that happened on earth and on Olympus was revealed. Tiresias revealed to Amphitryon the truth. His wife had been deceived by Zeus himself, who had spent the night with her, a night that lasted 3 times longer than usual. Amphitryon, learning the truth, was beside himself with rage, and he wanted to burn Alcmene on a pyre for her betrayal, even if this betrayal had been committed with a god. He ordered his servants to prepare the fire, and Alcmene, who was innocent because she had been deceived, turned to Zeus with a plea for help. And Zeus, who watched everything from Olympus, heard her prayers and sent rain that extinguished the flames and saved her from death. Seeing this miracle, Amphitryon realized that he could not fight against the gods, and that his wife was innocent, and he forgave her. When Alcmene gave birth to 2 sons, she named the elder Alcides, which meant descendant of Alcaeus, in honor of Amphitryon's grandfather, who was a famous warrior and hero, and she named the younger Iphicles, in honor of her own maternal grandfather. Amphitryon, who knew the truth about Alcides's origin, accepted him as his own son and raised him with love and care, because he knew that this boy was not an ordinary child but the son of Zeus himself, and that his fate would be great and that his name would become known throughout Greece. By the way, the story of how Alcmene conceived 2 sons from 2 different fathers was considered incredible, almost fairy tale-like for millennia, and many generations perceived it as purely mythological fiction, having no relation to real female nature. However, modern science has shown that this story, which seems so incredible, actually has a real biological basis, and that what happened to Alcmene, although extremely rare, is possible from the point of view of modern genetics. This phenomenon, which bears the scientific name of heteropaternal superfecundation, occurs when 2 eggs mature in a woman's cycle, and each is fertilized through natural intercourse with different men. This leads to the birth of fraternal twins, each of whom will have a different biological father. The probability of such an event, according to experts, is approximately 1 case in 13,000 twin pregnancies, and worldwide, about 20 such cases have been described in the scientific literature. This makes the phenomenon exceptionally rare but not impossible, and it requires no medical intervention and occurs naturally, like any other pregnancy. Hera, the queen of Olympus, was a woman of strong character. She did not forgive Zeus for his numerous affairs, and she certainly was not going to forgive little Alcides. Learning of his birth, the goddess flew into such a rage that she could have burned half of Olympus. But instead of causing a scandal, she acted more cunningly. She sent two huge venomous snakes directly into the infant's cradle. This gift, it must be said, was akin to a modern hit job, only without a phone call and without warning. But the son of Zeus was no ordinary infant. He was only 8 months old, but his muscles already knew what strength was. As soon as the snakes approached, he awoke, without crying, without tears, and simply seized them with his small but already deadly hands, and strangled them, both of them, in 1 minute. The snakes did not even understand what had happened, and Heracles had already returned to his infant dreams. This scene instantly became a legend. Artists, sculptors, poets, all wanted to capture this moment. A tiny child who is not afraid of monsters, not afraid of poison, not afraid of anything. And today we can see these images in museums around the world. But there are two places that are especially famous, and both are in America. The first is the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You surely know it. Well, at least by its steps. Yes, those very steps that Sylvester Stallone ran up in the film Rocky. The museum, which has become a symbol of perseverance and victory, houses a painting by the British artist Sir Joshua Reynolds, painted in the 18th century. It depicts little Hercules strangling the snakes, and his face expresses that very determination which would later help him survive all 12 labors. The second is the Brooklyn Museum. It is not as famous as the Philadelphia Museum, but in the art world, it is a giant. It houses a bronze statuette, infant Heracles strangling the snakes, created sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BC. This tiny figurine, just a few centimeters high, contains all the power of ancient craftsmanship. One could spend hours examining how the little hero grips the snakes, and marvel at how the ancient sculptor managed to convey this power in bronze. So if you ever find yourself in Philadelphia or New York, be sure to visit these museums. And remember, the same determination with which little Heracles gripped the snakes helped him overcome every obstacle. Like Rocky, he never gave up. And like Rocky, he rose after every fall. After Heracles strangled the snakes, his father Amphitryon realized that the boy needed a mentor capable of harnessing his incredible strength and directing it properly. He sent the young hero to the slopes of Mount Pelion in Thessaly, where in a deep cave lived Chilon, the wisest and kindest of all centaurs. Unlike his wild and unruly kin, Chilon was famous for his wisdom and knowledge. He was the son of the Titan Cronus, which made him the half-brother of Zeus himself and originally endowed with immortality. Chilon was not merely a teacher, but the embodiment of the civilized principle in a world inhabited by crude and unrestrained beings. Chilon was the ideal mentor for Heracles. He himself was a student of Apollo and Artemis, who taught him medicine, prophecy, music, and also the art of archery and hunting. It was this unique set of knowledge and skills that he was to pass on to the young hero. On the slopes of Pelion, among ancient forests and mountain streams, Heracles' training began. Chilon taught him not only military art and strategy, but also medicine, archery, and athletics. He instilled in him not only physical strength, but also the discipline so necessary for the future hero. Mount Pelion was not merely a place of solitude for the wise centaur. It was a true school of heroes, a kind of university for the future legends of Hellas. Cheiron was the most famous mentor for a whole host of Greek heroes. Among his students were Achilles, whom he fed with lion's meat to make him a fearless warrior; Jason, for whose journey Cheiron made the first celestial globe; Asclepius, to whom he passed the art of healing; and also the Dioscuri, Orpheus, and many others. All of them together were called the heroes of Pelion. Cheiron taught his wards not only military affairs, but also music, healing, gymnastics, and the art of prophecy. Interestingly, there is not much evidence of Heracles' direct training with Cheiron. Scholars note that Cheiron is mentioned as Heracles' teacher in only two literary sources: in Scholia, that is, notes to the poet Theocritus, and in the work of Plutarch. However, even these brief mentions are enough to confirm that Heracles was one of those who spent his youth in this legendary school on Mount Pelion. Cheiron became not merely a mentor, but a true friend to Heracles. However, their close friendship was overshadowed by a tragedy that occurred already in the hero's adult years. Once, while pursuing other unruly centaurs who had taken refuge in Cheiron's cave, Heracles burst inside and accidentally wounded his teacher with an arrow smeared with the poison of the Lernaean Hydra. The wound was fatal. Being immortal, Cheiron could not die and was doomed to eternal torment. He gave up his immortality in exchange for Zeus freeing Prometheus. After his death, Zeus placed Cheiron in the sky as a constellation, forever leaving his image in the memory of people. Thus Heracles, unintentionally, became the cause of the death of his very first teacher. After the young man spent his early years on the slopes of Mount Pelion, where the wise centaur Cheiron taught him to handle weapons, understand nature, and listen to the stars, the time came for another part of his education, which was considered in Greece no less important for any noble young man than the ability to wield a sword or a bow. And if Cheiron, who was immortal and kind, managed to find an approach to his unusual student, the next teacher chosen for him by Amphitryon turned out to be a completely different man. As was customary in those mythical times, the young man had to master not only martial arts, but also the more peaceful arts, playing the lyre, singing, and poetry, which were considered signs of true civilization and cultivated in a person a sense of harmony and measure. And for this, Amphitryon invited the best teacher that could be found at that time, and this teacher was Linus, the brother of Orpheus, the son of Apollo and the muse Calliope, the very man who, according to tradition, invented melody and rhythm. It was believed that Linus was one of the greatest musicians of his time, and his students included not only mortals, but also the gods themselves. He was known for his strictness and his demanding approach to teaching, which left no room for errors or carelessness. Linus, who was accustomed to obedient and diligent students, turned out to be completely unprepared for what he had to face. Heracles, who was then still called Alcides, firstly, was not accustomed to being corrected by anyone, and secondly, showed no interest in music. He struggled to master the lyre, because his fingers, which were made to grip weapons, refused to obey the subtle and elegant movements required to play the strings. Linus more and more often corrected the negligent musician and pointed out his mistakes, and his voice became increasingly sharp and impatient, until one day the teacher lost his composure and struck his student as punishment for his carelessness. In Heracles, who was not only strong but also proud, rage instantly boiled up which was an integral part of his nature and which often made him lose control over himself. He grabbed the lyre he had just been playing and, without thinking about the consequences, struck his teacher on the head with it. The force of the blow was so great that Linus fell dead, and Heracles, who had not wanted this death, realized that he had made an irreparable mistake. This was the first murder he had committed, and it cast a shadow over his entire life. And this tragedy, which would later repeat itself in his life with the centaur Chilon, shows that even the strongest and greatest heroes cannot escape their fate, and that they often become victims of circumstances, of their own strength, and of their own anger. Amphitryon realized that his ward needed to find another occupation, and he sent him to tend the herds on Mount Cithaeron, far from people and from civilization. And this exile, which was meant to be a punishment for the murder, became the beginning of his path to glory and to immortality. By the way, if you want to learn more about Linus, his origin, and his tragic fate, we invite you to watch our separate episode dedicated to this forgotten musician, where we examine in detail his life and his influence on all subsequent Greek culture. After the hot-tempered youth was sent to tend the herds on Mount Cithaeron, he did not remain idle for long, because fate was preparing new trials for him that would glorify his name and lead him to his first marriage, which, as it seemed then, was to be the beginning of a happy and peaceful life. Thebes, his native city, which had given refuge to his parents Amphitryon and Alcmene, found itself under threat. The Minyans, a powerful tribe that lived in Orchomenus and controlled important trade routes, attacked Thebes and demanded a humiliating tribute from them. This tribute was so heavy that the inhabitants of Thebes, who were proud and freedom-loving, could not accept it, but they were too weak to resist, and they were already preparing to surrender when a young man, who could not tolerate injustice, decided to defend his native land. He gathered a detachment of the bravest warriors who were ready to follow him, and he led them against the Minyans. In the battle, which was fierce and bloody, he displayed such strength and such courage that the enemies were defeated, and Thebes was freed from the humiliating tribute. This victory, which was achieved through his valor, made him a folk hero and brought him fame throughout Greece. When the news of Alcides' victory reached Thebes, King Creon, who ruled the city and who was grateful to the hero for saving his people from shame and ruin, decided to reward him with the most precious gift he could offer, and he gave him his eldest daughter Megara as his wife, who was known for her beauty and her virtue. This marriage, which was not only a political alliance but also an expression of sincere gratitude, was to become the beginning of a new chapter in the life of the one who would soon be renamed from Alcides to Heracles, a chapter that, as it seemed, was to be filled with happiness and peace. The young man joyfully accepted the king's offer and married Megara, and the newlyweds settled in Thebes, in the house of Amphitryon, and their life together, at first, was happy and serene. They enjoyed each other and a peaceful family life. The couple soon had children, and according to the most common version, given by the mythographer Apollodorus, they had 3 sons, named Thorymachus, Creontiades, and Dacon. Although some sources mention other names, this shows that even in antiquity there was no consensus on exactly how many children Heracles had from his first marriage. He lived in Thebes, enjoying peace and happiness, and he probably thought that all his suffering was behind him, and that he could finally enjoy the fruits of his labors. But fate, which was inexorable, and the gods, who were capricious, decided otherwise, and they prepared for him a trial that was to be the most terrible in his life, and that was to destroy everything he loved. Hera, who watched the happiness of Zeus's illegitimate son, decided to strike him in the very heart. She used her powers to send madness upon the young hero. For this purpose, she sent Iris and Lyssa, the goddess of madness and rage, to carry out her will. At the moment when Alcaeus was offering thanksgiving sacrifices to the gods in his home, as was customary for pious people of that time, Lyssa penetrated his mind, and his consciousness became clouded. In a fit of madness sent by Hera, the young man ceased to see his wife and children, and it seemed to him that before him stood not his loved ones, but his sworn enemies. According to one version, he mistook them for the children of King Eurystheus, whom he did not yet know at that time, but who would later become his tormentor. According to another version, he saw in them one of his enemies, King Lycus, whom he had previously killed, and Hera herself, his eternal persecutor. In mad rage, he seized his bow and arrows and began to kill everyone who was near him. He killed his sons, one by one, either shooting them with his bow or throwing them into the fire. He killed Megara, his beloved wife, and in the heat of the moment also killed two nephews, the children of his half-brother Iphicles, who happened to be nearby at that fateful moment. But when the fit of madness passed, our hero awoke and saw what he had done, and he was overcome with horror and despair, because he realized that he had made an irreparable mistake, that his hands were covered with the blood of those he loved most in the world. He wanted to kill himself, because he could not live with this knowledge and this guilt, and he was already ready to throw himself into the fire or pierce himself with a sword. But his adoptive father Amphitryon and his friend Theseus, the king of Athens, who came to his aid, dissuaded him from this step. Theseus explained to him that he should not die, because he must atone for his guilt, and that he must live to become better and to earn the forgiveness of the gods. And he took him with him to Athens, so that he could find a way to purify himself from his sin. And he set out for Delphi, to the most famous oracle in Greece, which was located in the temple of Apollo, and which was known for its prophecies that determined the fates of kings and common people alike. The hero of our story asked the oracle what he must do to purify himself from his sin, and the Pythia gave him an answer that was to determine his entire subsequent life. She told him that he must serve his kinsman Eurystheus, the king of Mycenae and Tiryns, and perform 12 labors that he would assign to him, and that only after this could he be purified from his guilt and receive immortality. This prophecy was both a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand, it promised him glory and immortality, and on the other hand, it condemned him to years of servitude and suffering. Delphi is located in a picturesque mountainous region on the southern slope of Mount Parnassus in Phocis, approximately 180 kilometers from Athens, at an altitude of almost 600 meters above sea level. The ancient Greeks considered Delphi the center of the world. According to myth, Zeus, wishing to find the middle of the earth, released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the world, one from the east, the other from the west. They met precisely above Delphi. This place was marked by a sacred stone called the omphalos, which in Greek means navel. According to tradition, it was a meteorite that fell from the sky. It was kept in the temple of Apollo as the greatest shrine, adorned with bands and anointed with oil. The Delphic oracle was founded, according to tradition, by Apollo himself, who killed the serpent python that guarded this place and established his sanctuary there. Before him, there existed oracles of other deities here, such as Gaia, Themis, and Poseidon, but it was Apollo who made Delphi the main religious center of Greece. Modern researchers date the appearance of the oracle to Mycenaean times, and its flourishing, it is believed, falls on the 7th to 5th centuries BC, when pilgrims from all over the known world flocked to it. In Delphi, the priestess prophetess, who was called the Pythia, sat on a tripod over a cleft in the earth, from which, it was believed, fumes rose that induced prophetic trance, and she conveyed the will of the god to those who came to her for advice. The name Pythia comes from the name of the serpent Python, whom Apollo killed. According to one version, even the ancient name of Delphi, Pytho, is connected with the Greek verb meaning to rot, which refers to the decaying body of the slain serpent. This Pythia was not merely a prophetess, but the chief advisor for rulers and common people who sought answers to their questions. The predictions of the Pythia, uttered in a state of trance, were often dark and ambiguous, and their final meaning was formulated by the priests of the temple. Let us return to our hero. When he stood before the Pythia in the sanctuary of Apollo, he received not only the verdict that determined his future, but also something more, something that was to change his fate forever. At the moment when the priestess prophetess uttered the words that were believed to belong to Apollo himself, she gave him a new name. Until that moment, he had been known as Alcides, descendant of Alcaeus, a name given to him at birth in honor of his grandfather, which spoke of his origin and the strength of his lineage, the name by which we have called him until now. But now we have arrived at the moment when the priestess proclaimed, from this day forward, he would bear the name Heracles, which means glory of Hera. In this name lay the bitter irony that permeated his entire life. Hera was his sworn enemy, the source of all his suffering. And now the oracle commanded him to bear a name that glorified that very goddess who hated him. The meaning of this command was deep and almost cruel. It was precisely these persecutions, this enmity, that would make him great. His glory would be born from her hatred, and his labors would become a response to her curses. The name was to become not merely a label, but a symbol of his destiny, to become a hero despite all the machinations of the gods. From this day, Alcides disappeared, and Heracles was born, a hero whose name would live for centuries. And when we hear this name today, we must remember that behind it lies not only strength and glory, but also tragedy, redemption, and that very bitter irony of fate that made him immortal. It is worth noting that the name given to the hero by the Delphic oracle was not the only one he would ever bear. In the centuries that followed, as Greek culture spread across the Mediterranean and was adopted by the rising power of Rome, the name underwent a transformation. The Greeks called him Heracles, which, as we have seen, means glory of Hera. But when the Romans encountered this hero, they did not simply borrow the Greek name. They adapted it to their own tongue, passing it through the filter of the Etruscan language, where it appeared as Hercule or Heracle. From this Etruscan intermediary, the Latin form Hercules was born. Thus, the hero of Greek myth became the hero of Roman myth as well. In Greek tradition, he was the son of Zeus. In Roman, the son of Jupiter. His labors remained the same, his strength undiminished, but his name had changed, and with it, his cultural fate. In the modern English-speaking world, it is the Roman name that has prevailed. We speak of the labors of Hercules, not the labors of Heracles. We remember the Disney film Hercules, not Heracles. The Greek original is known to scholars and enthusiasts, but the broader public knows him by his Latin name. And so the hero who was renamed by the oracle to honor his persecutor has, in the end, become known to most of the world by yet another name. one that carries the echo of Rome, of Etruria, and of the long journey of a story that refused to die. So Heracles stood before a choice: death or redemption. The Delphic oracle, which conveyed to him the will of Apollo, did not offer him an easy path, did not grant him forgiveness, and did not remove his guilt with a single word. Instead, the oracle commanded him to go to Tiryns, to his cousin Eurystheus, and to place himself in complete submission to this man whom he despised and who was weaker than him in every way, and to perform 10 labors that he would assign to him. Only after this could he be purified from his guilt and receive immortality. Who was this Eurystheus, before whom the greatest hero of Greece was to bow? Eurystheus was the king of Mycenae and Tiryns, the grandson of Perseus and the son of Sthenelus and Nisippe. He was Heracles' cousin, and his birth was shrouded in intrigue that forever determined Heracles' fate. It all began with Zeus, who, wishing for his son to become the ruler of Mycenae, gave an unbreakable oath that the first child born from the lineage of Perseus on a predetermined day would become the supreme king and would rule over all earthly peoples. And this day was the expected day of Heracles' birth. However, Hera did not sit idly by and decided to actively intervene in the course of events, using her official position as the goddess of family and childbirth for personal purposes. To prevent the desired infant from being born on time, she, using her power and cunning, accelerated the birth of Nisippe, the wife of Sthenelus, who was also from the lineage of Perseus, and delayed the birth of Alcmene, who was to give birth to Heracles. And how did she manage this? Quite simply, she did not invite the goddess of childbirth, Eileithyia, to Alcmene, as was customary, and with the help of the Moirai, the goddesses of fate, who sat with clasped hands, creating a spell that held the child within, she forced Alcmene to suffer in labor until Eurystheus was born. Eurystheus was born 7 months old, premature and weak, but he was born on the appointed day first, and it was he, not Heracles, who became king of Mycenae and received power over all the descendants of Perseus. When Alcmene finally gave birth to Zeus's son, it was too late. The Thunderer, who was enraged that his plan had been destroyed, but who could not break his oath, was forced to acknowledge Eurystheus as king, but he also made an agreement with Hera that if his son performed 10 great labors that Eurystheus would assign to him, he would receive immortality and be accepted on Olympus. Thus the weak and cowardly Eurystheus, not the mighty Heracles, became king of Mycenae, and it was to him that Heracles was to serve, carrying out his orders and subjecting himself to humiliations and dangers in order to atone for his guilt and achieve immortality. Heracles accepted this condition and over the course of several years performed 10 labors, fighting monsters and carrying out impossible tasks. However, when he returned victorious and brought proof of his achievements, Eurystheus, who was afraid even to look at Heracles, refused to count 2 of them. He declared that the victory over the Lernaean Hydra did not count because Heracles had been helped by his nephew Iolaus, and that the cleansing of the Augean stables also did not count because Heracles had demanded payment for it. Thus, the mean and cowardly king, who could not bear the thought that his slave would become free, forced Heracles to perform 2 additional labors, and their total number reached 12. And this deception, this meanness, which was committed by a man who was weaker than Heracles in every way, became the final test of humility that our hero had to pass before he could gain his immortality. The 12 years that Heracles spent in the service of Eurystheus were years not only of hard labor, but also of constant humiliation. He was forced to obey a man he despised and to carry out his orders, which were often not only dangerous, but also insulting. And in this, perhaps, lies the important lesson of his life. Not that he was strong, but that he was willing to pay any price to atone for his guilt and restore his honor. Today we will not dwell in detail on each of the hero's labors. Allow me to remind you that you were promised a story of Hercules beyond the 12 labors. And we are not here to list whom he killed and whom he captured. We are here to understand how he became who he became. But you cannot remove words from a song. The 12 labors are milestones on Heracles' life path, and it would be wrong to skip them entirely. Therefore, let us recall them briefly as stations on his long and painful journey, only to refresh them in your memory. The first labor, the Nemean lion, a monster with an invulnerable hide that no weapon could pierce. Heracles tracked it to a cave near Nemea, where the lion, according to rumor, held women hostage, luring warriors into a trap. Heracles entered the lair and strangled the beast with his bare hands. From then on, he wore its skin as armor, and anyone who saw him knew. This man feared nothing, not even death. The second labor, the Lernaean hydra, a monster with poisonous breath and many heads that grew back. Heracles went to the Lernaean swamp, a place the Greeks considered one of the entrances to the underworld. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, he cauterized the wounds with torches so the heads would not regrow. His arrows, dipped in the hydra's poison, became his main weapon, deadly to all enemies. Eurystheus, however, refused to count this labor because Iolaus had helped Heracles. The third labor, the Ceryneian hind, a sacred animal of Artemis with golden horns and bronze hooves. Heracles pursued it for a whole year, from Ino to Hyperborea itself, before he could capture it alive and unharmed. This was not merely a test of strength, but a test of patience and self-control, because killing the hind would have incurred the wrath of Artemis herself. The fourth labor, the Erymanthian boar, a huge wild boar with monstrous tusks that ravaged the fields of Arcadia. Heracles drove it into deep snow, bound it, and brought it alive to Mycenae. Eurystheus, seeing the monster, hid in terror in a bronze jar buried in the ground. This tells us everything we need to know about their relationship. The fifth labor, the Augean stables, 30 years of filth and manure that had never been cleaned. Heracles cleaned them in a single day by diverting the courses of 2 rivers, the Alcaeus and the Punius, and channeling them through the stalls. King Augeas promised him 1/10 of his herd for this, but refused to pay, and Eurystheus again refused to count the labor because Heracles had demanded payment for it. The sixth labor, the Stymphalian birds, monsters with bronze beaks, wings, and claws, which used their feathers as arrows and fed on human flesh. They inhabited the marshes near Stymphalus. Heracles drove them away with bronze rattles given to him by Athena, and then shot them with his arrows. Yes, sometimes any hero must be not only strong, but also cunning. The seventh labor, the Cretan bull, a sacred animal of Poseidon that ravaged the island, tearing up crops and destroying walls. King Minos allowed Heracles to take the bull. The hero easily subdued it, caught it, and carried it on his shoulders to Mycenae. Eurystheus set the bull free, and it long terrorized Greece until it was killed by Theseus at Marathon. The eighth labor, the mares of Diomedes, for wild, untamed horses that fed on human flesh. Their owner, the Thracian king Diomedes, was the son of Ares. Heracles and his companions attacked the stables, and Diomedes himself was thrown into the bronze mangers, where his own horses tore him apart. Sated, they became calm, and Heracles easily led them to Mycenae. Yes, sometimes the only way to stop evil is to destroy its source. The ninth labor, the belt of Hippolyta. The queen of the Amazons possessed a belt given to her by her father, the war god Ares. Heracles journeyed to the land of the Amazons to obtain it for Admete, the daughter of Eurystheus. At first, Hippolyta received Heracles kindly and even promised to give him the belt. But Hera, disguised as an Amazon, sowed panic among the warrior women. In the ensuing battle, Heracles killed Hippolyta and took the belt. This was a labor that required not only strength, but also the ability to fight an entire army. The 10th labor, the cattle of Geryon. The three-headed giant lived at the edge of the world, on the island of Erythea. His herd of red cattle was guarded by the two-headed dog Orthrus and the herdsman Eurytion. Heracles killed both the dog and the herdsman, and then Geryon himself. On his way back, he drove the herd across the Libyan desert, where, exhausted by the heat, he shot an arrow at Helios himself, the sun god. Helios did not become angry, but gave Heracles his golden cup, in which the hero sailed across the sea. This was the farthest of all his journeys. The 11th labor, the apples of the Hesperides. Golden fruits from the garden at the edge of the earth, which were once a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera. The apples bestowed immortality and were guarded by nymphs and the dragon Ladon. Heracles did not kill the dragon. He enlisted the help of the Titan Atlas, who held the sky on his shoulders. Atlas brought the apples, but tried to trick Heracles into holding the sky forever. Heracles cunningly returned the sky to the Titan's shoulders and departed with the apples. Cunning and patience prevailed where brute force would have been useless. The 12th labor, Cerberus. The three-headed dog with a serpent's tail and serpents on his back, who guarded the entrance to Hades. Heracles descended into the realm of the dead and brought him to the surface, using no weapons, only his strength, his cunning, and his unyielding will. He was a mortal who returned from Hades alive and unharmed. Interestingly, despite the uniqueness of the situation of returning from the dead, he was not alone. Before him, Orpheus had descended into Hades, but he was not seeking a monster, but his beloved Eurydice. Orpheus charmed Cerberus with his music, lulling the guardian to sleep, while Heracles simply took by force what he needed. Two heroes, two paths, one goal, to enter the realm of the dead and return alive. Here they are, the 12 labors. 12 trials, 12 steps through hell. 12 times he could have given up, and he did not. The first 6 were in the Peloponnese, the remaining 6 in distant lands that the Greeks considered entrances to the underworld. Each labor was a step toward redemption. Each monster he killed was another step toward becoming human again. And that is why today we have dwelt on each of these labors. We have not listed how many heads the Hydra had, or how many horses Diomedes had. We look at the man behind them, at the one who wept at night, at the one who doubted, at the one who kept moving forward, even when he could not see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because Hercules Beyond the 12 Labors is not a story about strength. It is a story about resilience. It is the story of a man who walked through hell and emerged victorious. After Heracles brought Cerberus from Hades and stood before Eurystheus, his long servitude came to an end. The king, who over 12 years had never managed to rid himself of the hated hero, was finally forced to release him. Heracles was free, but his life did not become peaceful, and his nature, accustomed to struggle and wanderings, demanded movement. His life turned into a series of new enterprises, which the Greeks called perurga, meaning incidental deeds or additional labors. Unlike the 12 canonical labors that formed the core of his redemption, these new adventures were already his own choice, and they continued until the end of his days. It is worth mentioning that according to one version, which Pseudo-Apollodorus gives in his Bibliotheca, before setting out on new wanderings, Heracles returned to Thebes to settle his family affairs. According to this interpretation, in his fit of madness, Heracles had killed only his children, while Megara had survived. After his liberation from servitude to Eurystheus, Heracles decided that his marriage to Megara was ill-omened, and he did not wish to have more children with her, fearing a repetition of the tragedy. Therefore, he gave Megara in marriage to his nephew and faithful companion Iolaus. According to one version, Megara was 33 years old at the time, and Iolaus only 16. They had a daughter named Lipephaline, who was known for her beauty. Thus, Heracles, having completed one stage of his life, began the next, and his new adventures, which we will begin to describe in the following chapters, were no longer servitude but the free choice of a hero who continued to seek his place in the world. One of his most renowned adventures during this period was his participation in the expedition of the Argonauts, that legendary journey to distant Colchis in search of the Golden Fleece, which gathered under its banner the finest heroes of Greece. Among them were the twin Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, the great singer Orpheus, Peleus the father of Achilles, and many others. Heracles, who was the strongest and most famous of all, immediately took a special place among them. When the Argonauts gathered on the shore, preparing to set sail, they had to choose a leader, and all, as one, named Heracles, because he was the best of men. However, Heracles, who was not only strong but also wise, and who understood that his role might overshadow all the others, with his characteristic tact and diplomacy, declined this honor and yielded it to Jason. This gesture, made not from weakness but from respect for the common goal, strengthened Jason's authority and allowed the expedition to maintain its unity. Heracles was not merely a passenger on the Argo, he was its driving force. When the other heroes were exhausted, he could row for all of them, so great was his power. His strength and valor manifested in every trial that befell the Argonauts. When they landed on the island of Lemnos, where only women ruled, having killed all the men, Heracles was the only one who did not succumb to their charms and did not remain on the island. On the contrary, he anxiously awaited their continued journey. When they reached the land of the Dolions and were warmly received by their king Cyzicus, they were attacked by the six-armed giants, and Heracles, who led the ship's guard, repelled their attack, displaying incredible courage and strength. His participation in the expedition was so significant that, according to some researchers, he was the driving force that gave the expedition momentum and confidence, and his presence made the impossible possible. However, as often happens in the lives of heroes, his journey on the Argo was brief. He left the Argonauts before they reached Colchis, and the cause was a tragic loss that exposed his vulnerability and showed that even the greatest hero is not immune to suffering. When the Argonauts landed on the shores of Mysia, Heracles went into the forest to cut a tree for a new or to replace one that had broken. His young favorite, Hylas, went with him. Hylas was not merely a servant, but the closest person to him, whom Heracles adored with all his soul. While Heracles searched for a suitable tree, Hylas went to a spring for water, and there the forest nymphs were captivated by his beauty and drew him down into the depths. When Heracles returned and could not find Hylas, he fell into a frenzy, and he rushed through the forest, calling his name. But the boy had vanished forever. The loss of his beloved so shook him that, according to one version, he completely lost control of himself and could neither think nor act rationally. Meanwhile, the Argonauts, not waiting for Heracles, set sail, leaving him on the shore. When he returned to the sea and saw that the ship had gone, his anger was terrible, but there was nothing to be done. Thus Heracles, who was the best of the Argonauts, left them and went on his own way, continuing his endless wanderings. And although his participation in the expedition was brief, it remained forever in the memory of the heroes. And for us, 26 centuries later, this story has been preserved thanks to those who recorded it for future generations. Among these first keepers of memory was Hercules of Argos, one of the first Greek historians and one of those who were included in the expanded lists of the seven sages. He recorded the oral traditions about heroes, gods, and monsters, creating his genealogies, in which the story of the Argonauts found its place. If you wish to learn more about how these ancient tales have come down to us, I invite you to watch on our channel the episode dedicated to Hercules of Argos, where we examine in detail his life, his works, and his role in preserving myths that might otherwise have disappeared forever. This video, which is part of our series on the seven sages of Greece, will help you better understand how exactly we know what we know about Heracles and his time, and how the efforts of one man can help preserve the memory of an entire civilization. Now that we have traced Heracles' path from servitude to Eurystheus to his participation in the expedition of the Argonauts, the time has come to tell of one of the most significant and most brutal of his enterprises, which, like many of his deeds, was born not from a thirst for glory, but from a sense of wounded justice and a desire to avenge treachery. And this enterprise led him to the walls of Troy, that very city which, a generation later, would become the arena of the greatest war in Greek mythology and would be sung by Homer in his immortal Iliad. It all began many years earlier, when Heracles, who had not yet completed his 12 labors, was traveling through the world and one day found himself in the Troad, where he saw a girl chained to a rock, about to be devoured by a sea monster. This girl was named Hesione, the daughter of King Laomedon of Troy, and she was sacrificed to the monster because the gods Apollo and Poseidon, who had once built the walls of Troy and had not received the promised payment from Laomedon, had sent plague and a monster upon his kingdom. Heracles, who could not pass by injustice, offered to save Hesione in exchange for the magical horses that Zeus had given to Laomedon's grandfather Tros as ransom for the abducted Ganymede. Laomedon, desperate to save his daughter, agreed. Heracles killed the monster and saved Hesione, but when it came time to pay, Laomedon, true to his treacherous nature, once again broke his word and refused to give the promised horses. Heracles left then empty-handed, but he did not forget this humiliation, and when he had completed his wanderings with the Argonauts, he decided that the time had come to settle accounts with the king of Troy. He gathered a fleet, and different sources give different numbers of ships, from 6 to 18, and with him went the best heroes of Greece, among whom was Telamon, a faithful companion and future father of Ajax, and other warriors who voluntarily wished to go with him to Troy. When they arrived at the shores of the Troad, Heracles landed his warriors and began the siege of the city, which was protected by walls built by the gods themselves. The siege did not last long. Heracles and his warriors, displaying incredible courage, scaled the high walls and burst into the city. In the battle that broke out in the streets, Telamon was the first to break through the gates, and Heracles, who could not tolerate anyone surpassing him in valor, was ready to unleash his anger upon him. But Telamon, knowing his leader's character, quickly gathered a pile of stones and built an altar in honor of Heracles, thereby acknowledging his supremacy, and this calmed the hero. Heracles burst into the city and killed Laomedon with his bow, and then slew all his sons, sparing only one, Podarces, who was later renamed Priam. Hesione, whom he had once saved, Heracles gave as a reward to Telamon, who had fought beside him, and she became the mother of the famed archer Teucer. Having razed the city to the ground, Heracles left Troy in ruins, and it remained desolate until Priam, the sole survivor of the royal house, rebuilt it, only to witness its fall again a generation later. Among all the wanderings and adventures that befell Heracles after his liberation from service to Eurystheus, there was one that perhaps had even greater significance for the fate of all humanity than all his 12 labors combined. This was the liberation of the Titan Prometheus, that rebellious son of Iapetus who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind, and who for this was chained to a rock at the edge of the world and condemned to eternal torment. The punishment of Prometheus was cruel and ingenious. Zeus chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, and every day a great eagle came to him and pecked out his liver, and every night the liver grew back anew, only to become the bird's prey again the next day. These torments, according to different versions, lasted from several centuries to 30,000 years. Heracles, who at the time was performing his 11th labor and obtaining the golden apples of the Hesperides, met Prometheus on his way to the garden at the edge of the world. Seeing his suffering, he could not pass by and decided to free the Titan. However, to do this, Heracles needed not only to kill the eagle, but also to obtain Zeus's permission. Heracles, who was the son of the supreme god, turned to his father with a plea for mercy for the Titan. And here, an ancient secret came to the rescue, which Prometheus had kept for ages. He knew that if Zeus married the sea goddess Thetis, they would have a son who would overthrow his father, just as Zeus had once overthrown Cronus. Prometheus, who had always been cunning and far-sighted, was ready to reveal this secret to Zeus in exchange for his liberation. Zeus, who did not want to repeat his father's fate, agreed to this exchange and ordered his son Heracles to free Prometheus from his torments. Heracles, having received his father's permission, climbed the rock to which the Titan was chained. Using his bow and arrows, dipped in the poison of the Lernaean Hydra, which never missed their mark, he killed the eagle that tormented Prometheus. Then he broke the chains that bound the Titan with his bare hands and removed the diamond point from his chest, with which he had been nailed to the rock, freeing him from centuries of suffering. According to Apollodorus, who gives one of the most detailed versions of this myth, when Heracles freed Prometheus, he had to symbolically take his place, and for this he bound his head with olive branches, as if taking upon himself part of his suffering. When Prometheus was freed, Zeus reconciled with him, and the Titan, who had been exiled from Olympus, was restored to his rights and received forgiveness. The liberation of Prometheus was not merely an act of mercy, but also an important stage in Heracles' own development as a hero. He not only showed compassion for the suffering Titan, but also restored justice, which had been violated many centuries before. He also received from Prometheus invaluable advice that helped him complete his 11th labor and obtain the golden apples of the Hesperides. The image of Prometheus lives on in American culture to this day. You may have seen him without even realizing it. The gilded bronze statue of Prometheus in Rockefeller Center in New York is one of the most recognizable sculptures in the city. It towers over the famous skating rink, and every year, millions of tourists walk past it, not always knowing that this mighty titan, bearing fire to humanity, was freed by Heracles. And if you have watched Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer or read the biography American Prometheus, you know that the creator of the atomic bomb was compared to the titan who stole fire from the gods. Robert Oppenheimer, like Prometheus, gave humanity a power that no one asked for, and paid for it with suffering and exile. Even Ridley Scott's science fiction film Prometheus is named in his honor, because the myth of the titan who brought knowledge but was punished continues to inspire us today. After the liberation of Prometheus, Heracles continued his wanderings, moving through Thessaly, and fate led him to the house of the hospitable King Admetus, the ruler of the city of Phaerae. Admetus was known for his hospitality and kindness, but in his house deep sorrow reigned, because his wife Alcestis, the beautiful daughter of King Peleus, had just voluntarily given her life for her husband. On the day of Admetus's wedding, when he had won the contest for Alcestis's hand, but had forgotten to offer the proper sacrifice to Artemis, the goddess sent a serpent to his marriage bed, an ill omen of impending death. The three Moirai, the goddesses of fate, foretold that the king of Phaerae would have a short life. The Moirai are three sisters, the daughters of the goddess of necessity Ananke, and their power extends even to the gods, because even Zeus cannot change what they have decreed. Their names, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, speak of their relentless work. Clotho, whose name means the spinner, spins the thread of human life, determining its length. Lachesis, the apportioner, distributes the lots of life, drawing this thread through all the vicissitudes of fate. And Atropos, the inevitable, at the appointed hour cuts the thread with her shears, ending a person's life. They sit at the spindle and weave the fates of all mortals, and no one, neither men nor gods, can dispute their decisions. It was they who, according to myth, once foretold Admetus's imminent death. But Admetus had a powerful protector. Apollo, who had once served him as a shepherd in punishment for killing the Cyclopes, was indebted to him and wanted to save his beloved. Knowing that the goddesses of fate could not be appeased or persuaded, Apollo resorted to cunning. He made the Moirai drunk with wine, and when they, intoxicated, lost their vigilance, he extracted from them a promise that Admetus could escape death if someone agreed to die in his place. This was the rarest case when even the inexorable goddesses of fate were deceived, and Admetus received a chance at life. But when the appointed hour came, none of his closest friends, none of his aging parents, agreed to make this sacrifice, and only Alcestis, whose love was stronger than the fear of death, volunteered to descend into the kingdom of Hades instead of her husband. Heracles, who arrived in Phaerae on the very day of her funeral, did not know what had happened, and Admetus, true to his hospitality, did not want to sadden his guest with the sad news. So he received Heracles with warmth and held a feast for him, hiding his grief. But Heracles, whose mind was sharp and whose heart was sensitive, noticed that the servants were dressed in mourning and insisted that he be told the truth. Learning of Alcestis's sacrifice, he did not delay, because he could not leave injustice unpunished, and he decided to repay Admetus for his hospitality in the most incredible way. He decided to bring Alcestis back from the realm of the dead. Heracles went to the queen's tomb, and there, according to one version given by Apollodorus, he lay in wait for Thanatos himself, the demon of death, and engaged him in hand-to-hand combat. This was a battle in which there was no place for weapons or cunning, only strength against strength, and Heracles, whose might was the gift of the gods, overcame death itself, wrested Alcestis's soul from him, and returned it to the queen's body. According to another version, given by the same Apollodorus, he descended into the underworld itself, where Persephone, moved by his courage or perhaps respecting him as the son of Zeus, released Alcestis back to the earth. When Heracles brought Alcestis to Admetus, the king could not believe his eyes, and he, overwhelmed with amazement and joy, did not immediately recognize his wife until Heracles removed her veil. The name of Alcestis was not merely recorded in myths, but it became immortal through the ages, because this very story formed the basis of one of the most famous tragedies of Euripides, Alcestis, produced in 1438 BC. In this play, Euripides portrayed Alcestis as a model of marital fidelity, and Heracles as one who by his deed proved that even death can be overcome by kindness and strength. In this story, Heracles, who was himself born in suffering, showed that very kindness and nobility that make him not merely a hero, but a man capable of great deeds not for glory, but to help his neighbor, and this trait of his character is not always, unfortunately, remembered by all who hear his story. After the liberation of Prometheus and the rescue of Alcestis, Heracles continued his wanderings, and soon he was to take direct part in the affairs of the gods themselves. The giants, the children of Gaia, the goddess of the earth, and Uranus, born from the drops of blood that fell upon the earth when their father was castrated, plotted to overthrow the Olympian gods from their thrones and seize power over the world. This was the Gigantomachy, from the Greek words gigas, meaning giant, monstrous giant, and mache, meaning battle, combat. This was what the Greeks called that very war in which the Olympian gods fought the giants for the very existence of cosmic order. It was a battle to the death, and the Olympians, led by Zeus, prepared for the final conflict. But they had one problem. A prophecy foretold that the gods could not defeat the giants without the help of a mortal hero. And this hero was to be Heracles, the son of Zeus by a mortal woman, who had already proven his strength and valor in the 12 labors. Hera, who had always hated Heracles, this time herself summoned him to aid, because she understood that the outcome of the war depended on his participation. Heracles, in turn, did not hesitate and agreed to join the battle, and he set out for Pallene, a peninsula in Greece where, according to one version, the Gigantomachy was unfolding to fight alongside the Olympians against the monstrous giants. Learning of the impending battle, Heracles turned to his father Zeus for advice, and Zeus sent him in search of a magical plant that was to make the gods invulnerable to the giants. Heracles set out and, outpacing the giants, was the first to find this plant, thereby ensuring the victory of the Olympians. On the Phlegraean fields, where the battle unfolded, Heracles fought alongside the gods and displayed wonders of courage. His main opponent was Alcaeus, the strongest and most dangerous of the giants. Alcaeus was invulnerable on his native soil, and Heracles, who first tried to kill him with an arrow, saw that the giant, falling to the ground, immediately rose and continued to fight. Then the goddess Athena, who was nearby, suggested to Heracles that Alcaeus could be defeated only by tearing him away from his native land. Heracles, understanding the trick, seized the giant and dragged him beyond the borders of Pallene, after which he dealt him a mortal blow. Another giant, Porphyrion, was struck by Zeus with his lightning, and then Heracles himself shot an arrow at him. Together with the gods, Heracles slew the other giants as well. Apollo shot at Ephialtes, and then Heracles finished him off with an arrow in his right eye. Thus, one by one, the giants fell, and the battle ended in victory for the Olympians. The Gigantomachy was not merely a battle, but a symbol of the victory of order over chaos, of civilization over barbarism. Heracles' participation in this battle, which had been foretold by prophecy, became one of the most important episodes in his life, and it showed that even a mortal could become the equal of the gods and take part in the greatest events on a cosmic scale. Now let us recall how Heracles cleansed the stables of King Augeas, and how the king did not pay him for the cleaning services rendered. The king of Elis, the son of the sun god Helios, possessed countless herds and promised Heracles a tenth of his cattle for the cleansing of the stables. Heracles performed his work brilliantly, diverting the waters of the rivers Alcaeus and Punius through the cattle yard in a single day, so that the mountains of manure were washed away by the streams of water. But Augeas, learning that Heracles had acted on the orders of Eurystheus, refused to pay and even exiled his own son Phyleus from Elis for taking the hero's side. Heracles left then with nothing, but he swore to remember such cheating at the first convenient opportunity. And that opportunity came as soon as Heracles became a free man. Our hero gathered a large army of Arcadian warriors and invaded Elis, intending to seize the kingdom of Augeas. However, the first attack did not bring him success, because Augeas, who was an experienced ruler and military leader, managed to repel the assault. His nephews, the twin Molionides, came to his aid, who were considered among the most powerful warriors in Elis. In addition, Heracles was struck by illness, which delayed his military campaign. But Heracles would not have been Heracles if he could have given up. Having recovered and harboring even greater fury, he set an ambush for the Molionides at Chilon and killed them. Deprived of his strongest allies, the king of Elis was left defenseless. In the second invasion, Heracles and his army burst into the capital of Elis. After a fierce and bloody battle, he killed Augeas and all his sons, except one, Phyleus, who had once supported the hero and was spared for his loyalty. According to one version, Heracles killed Augeas with his deadly arrow, dipped in the poison of the Hydra. According to another version of the myth, Augeas survived and died of natural causes much later, but the most widespread version speaks of his death at the hands of Heracles. Having seized the kingdom, Heracles placed Phyleus on the throne of Elis, who became his faithful ally. He also took Augeas's daughter Epicaste, who bore him a son, Thestylus. And finally, in honor of his victory, Heracles founded the Olympic Games, which were to be held in Olympia, the sacred grove of Elis, in honor of Zeus every 4 years. According to another version, which Pausanias gives, Heracles erected 6 altars to the 12 Olympian gods and established athletic competitions. And when we hear of the Olympic Games, we must remember that their foundation is connected with the name of Heracles, who, as always, turned his fury and his thirst for justice into something great and immortal. After Heracles had dealt with Augeas and his allies, His anger turned to those who had once refused him aid or supported his enemies. Among them was Neleus, the king of Pylos and the son of Poseidon himself, who made the fatal mistake of refusing to receive Heracles when he came to him for purification from the murder of Iphitus. Neleus was bound by the ties of hospitality to Iphitus's father, King Eurytus, and therefore he did not wish to help a man who had killed the son of his friend. He rejected Heracles' request, not considering that it might cost him his life. Heracles, who never forgave insults and always repaid injustice in kind, swore to take revenge, and he waited until his affairs in Elis were completed before turning against Pylos. When Heracles came with his army to the walls of Pylos, he did not delay and did not negotiate, because he knew that Neleus would not change his decision, and that only force could make him pay for his arrogance. He began the siege of the city, and despite the fact that Neleus was the king of a mighty city and his sons were brave warriors, Heracles met no serious resistance. He burst into the city and killed Neleus himself and all his sons, except one, Nestor, who was at Gerania at the time and did not take part in the battle. Nestor, the sole survivor of Neleus's house, later became king of Pylos and one of the wisest and most experienced heroes who participated in the Trojan War, known for his wisdom and eloquence. He became a faithful ally of Heracles, and they swore eternal friendship to one another. One of the sons of the defeated King Neleus was Periclymenus, who had been endowed by Poseidon with the gift of changing his form, transforming himself into a lion, a serpent, and even a bee. He used his ability in an attempt to save himself, and when he turned into a bee and landed on one of the horses harnessed to Heracles' chariot, our hero, who was not only strong but also cunning, killed him, not allowing him to escape. After Heracles had dealt with Neleus and his house, his fury should have subsided, but fate prepared a new trial for him, which was to be the most agonizing of all, because this time he was to pay for his anger not with the blood of others, but with his own freedom. After completing the 12 labors, Heracles arrived in Oechalia to claim the promised reward, the hand of the beautiful Iole, daughter of King Eurytus. In an archery contest, Heracles surpassed all of Eurytus' sons and seemed to have earned the victory. However, the king, fearing that Heracles might once again kill his children, as he had once killed his sons by Megara, refused to give him his daughter. Eurytus, violating the sanctity of hospitality, mocked Heracles along with his sons, reproaching him for his servitude to Eurystheus and the murder of his own children. Enraged, Heracles left Oechalia, swearing revenge. Soon after, a herd was stolen from Eurytus, and the king accused Heracles of the theft. However, Iphitus, Eurytus' eldest son, who was a friend of Heracles and did not believe in his guilt, volunteered to find the herd and prove the hero's innocence. Iphitus went to Tiryns, where Heracles welcomed him warmly. They stood on the high walls of the fortress of Tiryns, built upon a lofty rock, when suddenly Heracles was seized by a furious rage, sent upon him by the great goddess Hera. Remembering the insult that Eurytus and his sons had inflicted upon him, Heracles, no longer in control of himself, seized Iphitus and threw him from the fortress wall. Unfortunate Iphitus was dashed to death. By this murder, committed against his will, Heracles angered Zeus, for he had violated the sacred custom of hospitality and the sanctity of friendship. As punishment for this murder, Zeus sent a grave illness upon Heracles. For a long time, Heracles suffered, wasted by the sickness, until finally he journeyed to Delphi to ask the oracle of Apollo through the priestess how he might be freed from this punishment of the gods. But the prophetess Pythia this time gave him no answer. She even drove Heracles from the temple as one defiled by murder. Enraged by this, Heracles seized the sacred tripod from which the Pythia delivered her prophecies, and thus angered Apollo. A fierce struggle arose between the sons of Zeus, the immortal god Apollo, and the mortal Heracles. Zeus did not wish for Heracles to perish. He hurled his shining thunderbolt from Olympus between the two sons, separating them and ending the conflict, and the brothers were reconciled. Then the Pythia gave Heracles this answer. He would receive healing only when he was sold into slavery for 3 years, and the money obtained for him would be given to Eurytus as compensation for the murdered son. Thus Heracles, the greatest hero of Greece, was once again forced to become a slave, and this illness and this servitude became his punishment for the murder of his friend, and once again they were to become his redemption and his purification. His new mistress for 3 years was a powerful woman who took pleasure in humiliating the national hero and reminding him that he was now not a free man, but a powerless slave. And this was a severe trial, because it was a trial not of the body but of the spirit, and it demanded from him a humility he had never possessed in abundance. Omphale dressed Heracles in women's garments and forced him to sit at the loom and spin wool alongside her maidservants. He, whose hands were accustomed to the sword and the club, which had gripped the throat of the Nemean lion and held up the heavens, was now compelled to perform work intended for women, and this was more terrible for him than any battle with a monster. And Omphale herself, donning Heracles' lion's skin, which covered her entirely and trailed behind her on the ground, girding herself with his sword, and placing his heavy club upon her shoulder, would stand before him and mock him, forcing him to watch her play with his weapons, reminding him that he was now at the mercy of her whims. Yet even in this humiliation, Heracles remained Heracles, and he could not remain idle. Sometimes Omphale, perhaps weary of his constant presence or wishing to play with him as a cat plays with a captured mouse, would release him from the palace, and he would set out into the surrounding lands to free them from bandits and monsters. One day, when he fell asleep in the shade of a grove near Ephesus, the tiny Socrates crept up to him, intending to steal his weapons. But Heracles awoke and captured them all, tying their hands and feet together, passing a long pole between their bound legs, and carrying them toward Ephesus. However, the Socrates were such jesters that their antics made the hero laugh, and he set them free. On another occasion, he came to Aulis to King Silius, who forced all strangers to work in his vineyards. When Silius attempted to force Heracles to work as well, the hero, who not only could not tolerate injustice, but also possessed the strength and will to oppose evil, tore out all the vines and killed the king himself for failing to honor the sacred custom of hospitality. But when the 3 years of servitude came to an end, Heracles finally regained his freedom. According to some versions, Omphale, learning who her slave truly was, voluntarily released him, allowing him to return to Tiryns. According to other sources, his term of service simply expired. There are also versions according to which a closer bond developed between them, resulting in Omphale not only releasing Heracles, but also marrying him and even bearing him several sons. In any case, having regained his freedom, Heracles once again possessed his full heroic strength and was ready for the new labors that awaited him on his long path to immortality. Among the many children of Heracles, there was one whose fate became closely intertwined with the greatest war of Greek mythology. His name was Telephus. He became king of Mysia, a land in Asia Minor, and played a key role at the very beginning of the Trojan campaign that would later lead to the very war described by Homer in the Iliad. This is the story of how an abandoned infant became a king, how an enemy of the Greeks became their ally, and how the son of Heracles showed the way to the walls of Troy. The story of Telephus began with a tragedy characteristic of many of Heracles' children. His mother was Og, the daughter of the Arcadian king Aeolus and a priestess of Athena in the goddess's temple at Tegea. Aeolus had received a prophecy that his grandson would overthrow him from the throne, and that his sons would perish at the hand of this grandson. To prevent this, he made his daughter a priestess of Athena, binding her to eternal virginity. However, Heracles, passing through Arcadia, saw Og and was seized with passion for her. He possessed her, and she bore a son. Learning of the child's birth, Aeolus flew into a rage. He ordered the infant to be exposed on Mount Parthenius, to perish from cold and wild beasts. But fate decreed otherwise. Shepherds found little Telephus on the mountainside. A doe stood beside him and nursed him with her milk. From the word elephos, meaning deer, and the Greek tela, meaning to nurse, the boy received his name, Telephus, meaning nourished by a deer. The shepherds, amazed by this miracle, took the child to themselves and raised him. When Telephus grew up, he, like many heroes, went to Delphi to learn of his origin. The oracle told him, "Go to Mysia, to King Teuthras. There you will find your mother." Telephus did so. King Teuthras of Mysia received him warmly. He married Telephus to his daughter Argiope and made him his heir. According to one version, Teuthras even married Og herself, Telephus' mother, and adopted her son. In any case, when Teuthras died, Telephus became the ruler of a powerful kingdom in Asia Minor. Many years later, when the Greeks had gathered a vast fleet to sail for Troy and bring back the beautiful Helen, they faced a problem. No one knew the exact route. They had no maps and relied only on rumors and guesses. Landing on the coast of Mysia, they mistook it for Troy and began ravaging the lands. Telephus, as king, could not allow strangers to plunder his country with impunity. He gathered an army and marched against the Greeks. In the battle, he fought with such fury that the Greeks suffered heavy losses. According to tradition, of all the sons of Heracles, Telephus was the most like his father. In this battle, Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, encountered Telephus. In the heat of battle, Achilles wounded him with his spear. Telephus fell, and the Greeks, realizing their mistake, hastily sailed away, leaving him bleeding. The wound proved unusual. It would not heal and caused unbearable suffering. Desperate for a cure, Telephus went to the oracle of Apollo to learn how to heal. The answer was enigmatic. He who wounded shall also heal. Then Telephus, disguised as a beggar, traveled to Greece to find Achilles. He came to Agamemnon and begged for help. Agamemnon realized that Telephus could be useful for their expedition. He knew the way to Troy. He persuaded Achilles to heal the wounded king. Achilles at first refused, saying he was a warrior, not a physician. Then Odysseus suggested a simple solution. Since the spear had inflicted the wound, the same spear could heal it. Achilles scraped rust from his spear and applied it to Telephus' wound. The wound healed instantly. In gratitude, Telephus agreed to help the Greeks. He showed them the way to Troy. Thus the son of Heracles, who had first been an enemy of the Greeks, became their ally and guide. Telephus' son, Eurypylus, continued his father's legacy. He led a Mysian army to aid the Trojans and fought on Priam's side during the Trojan War. And in memory of Telephus himself, a magnificent monument remained. On the famous Pergamon altar, one of the masterpieces of Hellenistic art, an entire frieze was carved, dedicated to his life. The kings of Pergamon, who ruled in Asia Minor, traced their lineage to Telephus and used his legendary origin to assert their right to rule. But let us return to Heracles. Among the many adventures that he found for his wild head, there was one that would lead him to his second lawful wife, Deianira. Her name translates from Greek as destroyer of her husband, and this prophetic name, alas, would not be an empty, ominous omen. Deianira was the daughter of the Caledonian king Aeneas and Althea, and the sister of the famous hero Meleager, the very one who led the hunt for the Caledonian boar. And there was one detail that tied Heracles' fate to this family. When Heracles descended into Hades for Cerberus, he met the shade of Meleager there. And Meleager asked him, upon returning to the world of the living, to marry his sister so that she would not remain without a husband and protection. Heracles gave his word and kept it. One day, Heracles went to Calydon to ask for Deianira's hand from King Aeneas. But he suddenly had a rival, and not a mere mortal, but the river god Achilles himself, the son of Oceanus and Tethys. Achilles was a powerful deity who could take on different forms. Sometimes he appeared as a bull, sometimes as a serpent, sometimes as a man with a bull's head. His appearance was so terrifying that Deianira, frightened by his form, prayed to the gods to save her from such a marriage. To decide Deianira's fate, Heracles and Achilles met in combat. This was not merely a skirmish, but a true battle of two titans. During the struggle, Heracles, whose strength was a gift of the gods, overcame his opponent. He broke off one of Achilles' horns, and this horn, according to tradition, became the cornucopia from which fruits poured forth. Defeated, Achilles withdrew, and Heracles, as promised, married Deianira. Let us pause here and examine the legend of the cornucopia in more detail. According to one version, which Ovid gives in his Metamorphoses, Heracles, having torn off the horn from Achilles, gave it to the nymphs, and they filled it with fruits and called it the horn of plenty. According to another version, Heracles gave this horn to the local inhabitants, which led to the prosperity of their land. This symbol had another, more ancient legend. According to it, the cornucopia belonged to the goat Amalthea, who nursed the infant Zeus with her milk in a cave on Crete when Cronus was devouring his children. When Zeus accidentally broke one of Amalthea's horns, he endowed it with magical power to fill with whatever its owner desired. In ancient Greece, the cornucopia became an attribute of many deities. Demeter, the goddess of fertility, Tyche, known to many as Fortuna, the goddess of luck, Persephone, the queen of the underworld. Its image can be found on ancient coins, mosaics, and sculptures throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans called it cornucopiae, the horn of plenty, and made it a symbol of peace, prosperity, and well-being. This ancient symbol did not remain in the past. It outlived Greece and Rome, passed through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and found its place at the very heart of American culture. The Smithsonian American Art Museum houses a monumental fresco, Achilles and Heracles, created in the 1940s by the American regionalist artist Thomas Hart Benton. In it, Benton depicted the struggle of Heracles with the river god Achilles. not as an abstract myth, but as a parable about man's struggle with the forces of nature in the American Midwest. Benton, himself a native of Missouri, saw in this myth a reflection of how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers tamed the Missouri River, transforming it from a destructive force into a source of fertility. And when Heracles in the fresco tears the horn from Achilles, that horn becomes the cornucopia, a symbol of the rich harvest that America's land gave her. Benton even connected this scene with the Marshall Plan, when American food was sent to war-torn Europe. Today, the cornucopia is one of the main symbols of Thanksgiving. This symbol is so firmly associated with the harvest festival that many Americans are unaware that it originates from Heracles' struggle with the river god. In American museums, one can find antique glass flasks from the 19th century, decorated with images of the cornucopia. They were inexpensive and popular among ordinary Americans. The cornucopia can be seen on the seals and coats of arms of several American states. On the Great Seal of the state of Wisconsin, it is depicted at the base of the shield as a symbol of the prosperity this land has given. On the seal of North Carolina, one of two female figures holds the cornucopia, symbolizing the fertility of the land. The cornucopia also appears on the seal of the state of Idaho, on the coat of arms of the city of Bakersfield in California, and in the architecture of federal buildings, such as the John Minor Wisdom United States Courthouse, where the sculpture Agriculture holds this symbol. Even in the United States Capitol in Washington, one can find the cornucopia in architectural details and murals. In modern culture, the cornucopia appears in the most unexpected places, such as in the film The Hunger Games and in Terry Pratchett's books, wherever abundance or its absence needs to be shown. Let us return to our story. Heracles and Deianira settled in Calydon, at the court of King Aeneas. They had children, among them Hylas, the most famous of Heracles' sons, the very one who would later lead the Heraclidae in their return to the Peloponnese. But happiness was not to last. Heracles committed another unintentional murder, and here is how it happened. In those times, a feast was not merely a meal, but a ritual with strict rules. At ancient banquets, servants would bring guests water for washing their hands several times during the evening. Feet were washed before reclining at the table, since the Greeks dined lying down, and dirty feet of a fellow diner were considered bad form. Once at a feast, a young man serving the guests brought Heracles water for washing his hands, but it was meant for washing feet. The servant's mistake was humiliating, as if he had placed Heracles on the same level as a person who was not even worthy of clean water for his hands. And although the Greeks ate with their hands, not using utensils, washing hands before eating and during the feast was a matter of hygiene. But at the same time, in this episode, a deep symbolism is hidden, far beyond simple etiquette. In the ancient world, the washing of hands had a sacred meaning. It preceded contact with higher powers and symbolized purification from defilement. In this ritual, water was not just water, but a boundary between clean and unclean, between the divine and the worldly. The insult inflicted on Heracles was not merely a servant's oversight. It was perceived by our hero as a public humiliation. Heracles in anger struck the young man, and he fell dead. This was not the first unintentional murder in Heracles' life, and not the last. But it forced him to leave his father-in-law's house and go into exile with his wife and children. To understand why this seemingly insignificant episode led to tragedy, one must remember the importance the ancient Greeks placed on the washing of hands. It was not merely a hygienic procedure. The water used to wash hands before eating had a ritual meaning. It separated purity from defilement, order from chaos. To offer a guest water for washing feet instead of hands meant not merely a breach of etiquette, but an insult to his sacred purity, placing him on the level of a servant or even an animal. This gesture, the washing of hands, was so important in the ancient world that its symbolism extended far beyond everyday etiquette. Let us recall another well-known story. The Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, before pronouncing judgment on Jesus Christ, took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just man." Pilate used that same ancient gesture of washing, which was understood by the people of antiquity and held great meaning for them. After Heracles was forced to leave Chilon together with Deianira and their children, they set out on a long journey, and during this journey they had to cross the turbulent river Ivenus, which flowed through Aetolia and was known for its swift and dangerous waters. Heracles, who could not carry his wife across the river because he needed to swim across himself, turned for help to the centaur Nessus, who lived on the bank and offered his services as a ferryman. Nessus was not an ordinary centaur, for he was the son of Ixion and Nephele, and like many of his kind, he was known for his rudeness and his treachery. He agreed to carry Deianira across the river on his back, and Heracles, trusting him and unaware of his true intentions, agreed to this. However, when Nessus was carrying Deianira across the river and reached the middle, he was so captivated by her beauty that he decided to abduct her. Ignoring the woman's cries and Heracles' warnings, who had already swum across the river, he dashed off at a gallop, hoping to escape the hero's wrath. Heracles, seeing what was happening, did not delay. He seized his bow, which never failed him, and shot an arrow at the centaur, dipped in the poison of the Lernaean hydra, which was so deadly that it gave no one a chance of survival. The arrow struck Nessus in the chest, and he, feeling his life ebbing away, knew he could not survive this wound. Being cunning to the very end, he decided to take revenge on Heracles in a sophisticated way. The centaur told Deianira, who was frightened and did not know what to do, that his blood, if collected and preserved, would possess a wonderful property. It would restore lost love. If Heracles ever grew cold toward her, she would only need to soak his garment in this blood, and he would love her again as strongly as on the first day. Deianira, who was naive and feared losing her husband's love, believed Nessus, collected his blood, and preserved it, unaware that it was poisoned with the hydra's venom and would become the cause of her husband's death. Nessus died, and Heracles, who came to the river and saw that Deianira was safe, calmed down and continued on his way. Years passed, and Deianira, who kept Nessus's blood, began to grow jealous of Heracles, who, like many heroes, could not remain faithful to one woman. She remembered the centaur's blood and decided to use it to bring back his love. And here is how it happened. One day, Heracles set out on a new campaign to take revenge on King Eurytus for the humiliation he had suffered when he was refused the hand of Iole. He gathered an army, laid siege to Oechalia, won the victory, and captured the city, of course killing Eurytus and all his sons, and taking Iole, the beautiful daughter of the king, who was the cause of his anger and his revenge, captive. Heracles, who was always vulnerable to female beauty, once again burned with love for Iole, and he sent her to his home in Trachis, where Deianira awaited him. And Deianira, seeing her rival, felt her heart tighten with jealousy and fear that she would lose her husband. Deianira, who was a gentle and loving woman but also weak in the face of betrayal, could not accept the thought that Heracles, who was her husband and the father of her children, might prefer another woman, younger and more beautiful, to her. She decided that she must win back his love. Deianira brought out the blood-soaked garment that Nessus had given her and which she had kept all these years as a precious talisman. She soaked a luxurious tunic with fragments of the treacherous centaur's blood, which she had prepared for her husband, and gave this garment to her faithful messenger Lycus, who was to deliver it to Heracles, along with the message that it was a gift meant to remind the hero of his love for her. When Lycus brought the tunic to Heracles, he, suspecting no danger, put it on. In that very moment, unbearable pain pierced his body, and the tunic, soaked in poison, began to eat into his flesh, burning his skin and corroding his muscles. Heracles tried to remove the tunic, but it clung to his body, and he could not manage to do so. In terrible agony, unbearable even for such a hero as Heracles, he writhed on the ground, smashing everything around him, cursing whoever had sent him this gift. And he finally understood that this was Deianira's doing, and his fury was terrible. When word reached Trachis that Heracles was dying in terrible agony, Deianira, who had been awaiting her husband's return and hoping for his love, learned the truth. She realized that she had become the unwitting murderer of her husband, and she, who was gentle and loving, could not bear this shame and grief. In despair, she took a sword and pierced herself, and her soul flew to the realm of the dead. This tragedy, born of jealousy and deception, became one of the most famous in Greek mythology. It was immortalized in the great tragedy of Sophocles, The Women of Trachis, which shows how even the noblest feelings can lead to the most terrible consequences, and how even the strongest heroes can become victims of love, which, like poison, can be deadly. Thus, the poison of the centaur Nessus, which Deianira had applied to the tunic, seeped into Heracles' skin, and the pain, which began as a burning sensation, quickly turned into a hellish fire, eating away at his flesh from within. This was not merely poison. It was the blood of the Lernaean Hydra, mixed with Nessus's bile, and it acted like acid, burning through living tissue. Heracles, who feared neither monsters nor gods, who had held Cerberus in his hands and fought the giants, found himself powerless before this invisible enemy. His body, which had endured 12 labors, was racked with convulsions. He understood that death was inevitable, and he had to meet it as a hero. In a final effort, overcoming the pain, Heracles rose and made his way to Mount Oeta, a massive mountain range in central Greece that rises above Thermopylae and the Euboean Gulf. Its steep slopes, covered with oak and olive forests, witnessed the final act of the greatest tragedy of antiquity. On the mountain's summit, where the wind whistled over the rocks, Heracles built a funeral pyre. He took off the lion's skin, the very one he had worn since the time of the Nemean lion, and lay down on the pile of logs. He asked his faithful friend Philoctetes to light the pyre. Philoctetes, the son of Poeas, known for his skill in archery, at first refused. He could not kill his friend. He could not watch the greatest hero of Greece burn alive. But Heracles, even in his agony, retained his power of persuasion. He spoke of immortality, of how death was not an end but a beginning. And Philoctetes, unable to refuse, brought the torch to the dry oak branches. The flames leapt toward the sky. They were as bright as the hero himself. Fire, which had been his enemy in the 12th labor, now became his liberator. Heracles lay still, allowing the fire to purify his flesh. His eyes gazed toward the heavens, where his father Zeus awaited him. The pain that had tormented him in his final days subsided. His body, which had been his chief weapon and his chief curse, turned to ash. And at the moment when the flames had almost consumed him, a thunderclap rang out. Lightning pierced the sky, and the figure of Zeus appeared for an instant in the clouds. Hera, his bitterest enemy, who had pursued him from his very birth, finally made peace with him. She acknowledged him as a hero. His mortal part, burned on the pyre, vanished, while his immortal part, the gift of Zeus, ascended to Olympus. Heracles, born a man, became a god. Cursed and humiliated, he was glorified and deified. Here it is worth making an important clarification to avoid confusion. Mount Oeta, where Heracles burned, is in central Greece, near Thermopylae. It has no connection to Mount Etna in Sicily, into whose crater the ancient Greek philosopher Empedocles is said to have stepped to prove his divine nature. Two mountains, two heroes, two eras, Oeta and Etna, similar names but different stories. Both heroes sought immortality, but their paths were different. When the flames of the funeral pyre on Mount Oeta died down, Heracles did not die in the sense in which ordinary mortals die. His body vanished in the fire, but his immortal soul, the gift of Zeus, ascended to Olympus. This event, which the Greeks called apotheosis, marked the completion of his long and agonizing journey to immortality. The gods received him with honors, recognizing him as worthy of taking his place among them as the greatest of heroes ever to live on earth. The most incredible turn of events was his reconciliation with Hera, his bitterest enemy, who had pursued him from his very birth. She acknowledged him as a hero and, as a sign of reconciliation, gave him her daughter Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth, as his wife. In some sources, it is said that in the Heraean near Mycenae there was an altar with a depiction of this marriage. Thus Heracles, born a man and suffering as a man, finally became a god, taking his place among the Olympians as the god of strength and courage, the guardian of Olympus. Before ascending the pyre, Heracles gave his bow and arrows, dipped in the poison of the Hydra, to his faithful friend Philoctetes, who had lit the pyre. This gesture was not merely an act of gratitude, but also a symbol that his strength and valor had not vanished with him. Heracles' bow and arrows, made by Apollo himself, became valuable weapons during the Trojan War and played a key role in the fall of Troy, proving that Heracles' legacy continued to live on in other heroes and influenced the fate of the world. Heracles left behind not only glory and the memory of his labors, but also something far more tangible, his descendants, who continued to live on earth. The descendants of Heracles, who were called the Heraclidae, were so numerous that they formed entire dynasties, and their struggle for power and for the lands they considered theirs by birthright became one of the longest epics in Greek history. The Heraclidae, like their great ancestor, were driven from their lands and wandered throughout Greece, trying to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Their struggle, lasting several generations, was a reflection of those real historical processes that took place in Greece at the end of the Bronze Age, when Dorian tribes invaded southern Greece and the Mycenaean civilization collapsed under their onslaught. The first to lead the Heraclidae in a campaign against the Peloponnese was Hyllus, the eldest son of Heracles. He invaded the peninsula through the Isthmus of Corinth, but was defeated and died in a duel with the king of Tegea. After his death, The Heraclidae swore an oath not to renew their attacks for 100 years. They waited and prepared. When the 100 years had passed, they attempted to invade the Peloponnese again, but their attempts, led by Cleodeus and Aristomachus, again ended in failure, and Aristomachus fell in battle. Then the sons of Aristomachus stepped forward, 3 brothers, Temenus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus. Unlike their predecessors, they finally succeeded. They gathered a Dorian army, invaded the Peloponnese, defeated Tisamenus, the king of Mycenae and Argos, and conquered most of the peninsula. After the victory, they divided the lands. Temenus received Argos, Cresphontes received Messenia, and Laconia, where Sparta was later founded, went to the sons of Aristodemus. Here we must recall Aristodemus, a direct descendant of Heracles, who became the father of the founders of the 2 royal dynasties of Sparta. Aristodemus had twin sons, Eurysthenes and Proclus. They became the first kings of Sparta and the founders of the 2 dynasties that ruled Sparta simultaneously, creating that unique system of dual kingship that characterized the Spartan state. The influence of the Heraclidae, of course, was not limited only to Sparta. One of the most striking examples is Corinth, where tyrants from the Heraclid dynasty ruled. The most famous of them was Periander, considered one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. He was known for his wisdom and his cruelty simultaneously. The son of Cypselus, he belonged to the Heraclid lineage, and his reign, lasting more than 40 years, made Corinth one of the most powerful cities in Greece. His court attracted poets and philosophers from all over Hellas. And finally, we must recall Chilon of Sparta, who lived in the 6th century BC and also belonged to the number of the 7 sages. Chilon was an ephor in Sparta, known for his wisdom and his sayings. It is to him that the famous phrase, "Know thyself," is attributed. Chilon was a witness to how the Spartan state, founded by the descendants of great Heracles, reached its peak and became the most powerful military power in Greece. As usual, I invite you to watch the episodes about Aristodemus, Periander, and Chilon. For your convenience, there is a playlist, the Anthology of the 7 Sages, on the channel. Do check it out, you won't regret it. The figure of Heracles, who became a symbol of strength and courage, also transformed into a symbol of philosophical reflections on what virtue is and how to achieve it. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle used the myths of Heracles to explain their ideas. His life, full of suffering and trials, became a mirror in which they reflected their conceptions of what it means to be a good man. The most famous philosophical story about Heracles is the parable of Heracles at the crossroads, which was told by the sophist Prodicus and transmitted by Xenophon in his Memorabilia. According to this parable, the young Heracles, having reached the age when he needed to choose his path, withdrew to a solitary place. There, 2 women appeared to him, personifying 2 paths. One of them was vice. She was dressed in bright garments and promised an easy life full of pleasures. She said, "If you make me your friend, I will lead you along the easiest and most pleasant path. You will taste all the joys of life and will not know hardship." The other was virtue. Modestly dressed, she spoke of the difficulties and trials that awaited him on her path, but also of the glory and immortality he could achieve if he chose her. Heracles, who was not only strong but also wise, chose the path of virtue. This choice, made in his youth, determined his entire life and all his labors. He became a symbol that a man must choose the difficult but right path. Socrates, who believed that virtue is knowledge and that no one does wrong knowingly, used this parable to show his students that virtue requires effort and is not easily attained. For him, Heracles was an example of how a man choosing virtue must be prepared for suffering and trials, through which alone true happiness is achieved. Plato, Socrates' student, created his philosophical system based on the contemplation of ideas, not on action. He preferred Eros, the god of love, to Heracles, the symbol of strength. However, even he could not ignore Heracles and used him in his dialogues. For instance, in the Protagoras, he mentions Prodicus's parable, clearly showing that even his opponents, the sophists, used Heracles to promote their ideas. Socrates in Plato's dialogues often swears by Heracles, which shows how deeply the hero's image was rooted in the consciousness of the Greeks. Aristotle, Plato's student, created an ethics based on the concept of the golden mean. He believed that virtue requires training and habit. Heracles, who performed 12 labors, was for him an example of how a man can develop virtue through constant effort. In his Nicomachean Ethics and in his Hymn to Virtue, he directly calls Heracles an exemplar of virtue. The Stoics, followers of Zeno, also used Heracles as an example. They saw in him a model of the wise man, capable of overcoming any difficulty and not yielding to passions. His labors were for them symbols of the inner battles that every man must wage to achieve wisdom and virtue. The image of Heracles also found its place in art. His figure was captured in sculpture, in painting, and even in the heavens. There he was placed among the stars as a constellation that still bears his name. The constellation Hercules, which in Latin is called Hercules, and in Greek Heracles, is one of the largest and most ancient constellations in the sky. It was known to the ancient Greeks, who saw in it the figure of a kneeling hero, standing on one leg and holding a club or lion skin in his hands. This constellation, included in Ptolemy's catalogue in the 2nd century AD, is one of the 48 constellations known to ancient astronomers. Today, the constellation Hercules is beautifully visible throughout the United States. It is located in the northern sky and is accessible for observation from all 50 states. The best time for its observation is the summer months, especially July, when it rises high above the horizon. In general, it can be seen from April to November. It remains one of the most recognizable constellations in the sky. And perhaps the most famous and impressive image of Heracles in art is the Farnese Hercules, one of the most famous sculptures of antiquity, which still astonishes viewers with its power and beauty. This scene, depicting a weary hero leaning on his club, was created in the 3rd century AD and is a Roman marble copy of a Greek bronze original created by Lysippus, one of the greatest sculptors of antiquity, who lived in the 4th century BC. The name Farnese comes from the Farnese family, who owned this sculpture during the Renaissance. The sculpture depicts Heracles at a moment of rest after his labors. His face expresses fatigue and reflection, and his body, covered with muscles and scars, shows all his wounds. This makes him not merely a hero, but a man who has passed through suffering and earned his rest. It was found in the 16th century in the baths of Caracalla in Rome, and has since become one of the most famous and copied works of ancient art. Replicas of it can be found in museums around the world, from London to St. Petersburg. The Farnese Hercules is not merely a statue, but a symbol that even the strongest and greatest heroes need rest, and that even their weariness can be majestic and inspiring. And so we have come to the finale of our long journey through the milestones of Hercules' life and death. When the flame of his funeral pyre died down, when his soul ascended to Olympus, and his constellation shone in the night sky, we must ask ourselves, did Hercules actually exist, or was he merely a myth, a fiction created by the ancient Greeks for inspiration? The answer is not simple. Most modern scholars believe that behind the myth of Hercules stands not one person, but several historical figures whose deeds over time merged into a single image. According to one version, the prototype of Heracles could have been a real Theban king or military leader who lived in the 13th to 12th centuries BC. Another version connects him with Tiryns and Mycenae, powerful centers of the Mycenaean civilization, whose rulers may have undertaken expeditions that inspired the myths of the labors. Ancient authors sometimes spoke of two Heracles figures, the hero demigod and a king historical figure who lived in the 9th to 8th centuries BC. Our hero was also identified with the Phoenician god Melkart, and the Dorians considered him their ancestor, which helped them justify their right to the lands of the Peloponnese. Archaeological finds in Mycenae, Tiryns, and Troy confirm that many of the events described in the myths of Hercules may have had a real basis. Excavations at Troy show that the city was destroyed several times in the Bronze Age, and the siege by Hercules may reflect one of the real historical events. Traces of the cult of Hercules throughout the Mediterranean, including figurines of the hero with a club, in Minoan Mycenaean layers of the 14th to 13th centuries BC, indicate that this cult existed even before the formation of the classical myth. If you wish to continue this journey into the world of ancient Greece, where myths intertwine with history, I invite you to explore other stories on this channel. Subscribe so as not to miss new bedtime biographies of heroes, sages, thinkers, and mythical figures whose images continue to shine brightly through the ages. Hercules fell and rose, but he always kept moving forward. He did not give up, and neither should you. Good night.